Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to b5. Pawn a7 to a6. Bishop b5 takes c6. Pawn d7 takes c6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Queen d1 takes d4. Queen d8 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Bishop f8 to d6. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to e7. Bishop c1 to e3. Castle kingside. Castle kingside. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight d4 to e2. Rook f8 to e8. Rook f1 to d1. Knight e7 to c6. Bishop e3 to f4. Knight c6 to e5. Pawn a2 to a4. Bishop c8 to e6. Knight c3 to d5. Rook a8 to d8. Pawn b2 to b3. Rook d8 to d7. Pawn c2 to c4. Pawn a6 to a5. Pawn f2 to f3. Rook e8 to c8. Rook d1 to d2. Knight e5 to g6. Bishop f4 to g5. King g8 to h8. Rook a1 to d1. Pawn f7 to f6. Knight d5 takes f6. Pawn g7 takes f6. Bishop g5 takes f6, check. King h8 to g8. Bishop f6 to c3. Rook c8 to d8. Bishop c3 takes a5. Knight g6 to f4. Knight e2 takes f4. Bishop d6 takes f4. Rook d2 takes d7. Rook d8 takes d7. Rook d1 takes d7. Bishop e6 takes d7. Pawn g2 to g3. Bishop f4 to e5. King g1 to g2. Bishop d7 to c6. King g2 to f2. King g8 to f7. Pawn f3 to f4. Pawn b7 to b6. Bishop a5 to d2. Bishop e5 to b2. King f2 to e3. Bishop c6 to b7. Pawn h2 to h3. Bishop b2 to d4, check. King e3 to f3. King f7 to f6. Pawn f4 to f5. Bishop d4 to e5. Bishop d2 to f4. Bishop e5 takes f4. King f3 takes f4. King f6 to e7. Pawn g3 to g4. Bishop b7 to c6. Pawn h3 to h4. Bishop c6 to e8. Pawn h4 to h5. Pawn h7 to h6. Pawn g4 to g5. Pawn h6 takes g5, check. King f4 takes g5. Bishop e8 to f7. Pawn h5 to h6. King e7 to f8. Pawn e4 to e5. Bishop f7 to g8. Pawn e5 to e6. Bishop g8 to h7. King g5 to f6. King f8 to e8. Pawn e6 to e7. Pawn c7 to c6. King f6 to e6. Bishop h7 to g8, check. King e6 to d6. Bishop g8 to h7. Pawn f5 to f6. Bishop h7 to f5. King d6 to e5. Bishop f5 to h7. King e5 to e6. Bishop h7 to g8, check. King e6 to d6. Bishop g8 to h7. Pawn f6 to f7, check. King e8 takes f7. King d6 to d7. Bishop h7 to f5, check. King d7 to d8. King f7 to g6. Pawn e7 to e8, promoting to queen, check. King g6 takes h6. Queen e8 takes e6, check. King h6 to h5. Queen c6 takes b6. King h5 to g4. Queen b6 takes c5. Bishop f5 to e4. Pawn b3 to b4. King g4 to f4. Pawn b4 to b5. King f4 to g4. Pawn b5 to b6. King g4 to f3. Pawn a4 to a5. King f3 to e2. King d8 to c7. King e2 to f3. Queen c5 to e5. Bishop e4 to d3. Pawn b6 to b7. Bishop d3 takes c4. Pawn b7 to b8, promoting to queen. Bishop c4 to d5. Queen b8 to b1. King f3 to g2. Queen b1 to e1. Bishop d5 to c4. Queen e5 to g3, checkmate.